Fenton Airfield, Northern Territory of Australia, August 13, 1943. Late afternoon. The runway is a strip of crushed coral hacked out of the bush, 2,000 miles from anywhere that matters. 12 four-engine bombers sit in the dispersal area, their olive drab paint dulled by red dust, their crews going through final checks in the heat. Each aircraft is loaded to 66,000 pounds. 6 500-pound bombs in the bay, 3,500 gallons of fuel in the wings. The total weight is so far beyond the manual that the engineers have stopped arguing about it. In the cockpit of the lead aircraft, Captain Gus Connery runs his fingers across the throttle quadrant. Behind him, in the nose compartment, his bombardier checks the bomb sight one last time. The bombardier is 20-year-old Lieutenant Jim Wright from Fort Worth, Texas. 44 years from this night, Wright will become the 48th Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. Right now, he is checking a Norden sight in a hot aluminum cockpit and waiting for the order to take off. At 5 o'clock, Connery releases the brakes. The bomber rolls forward, slowly at first, then faster, eating up the runway. The trees at the far end grow larger in the windscreen. The wheels lift at the last possible moment. The aircraft clears the treetops by inches. Behind it, at 5-minute intervals, 11 more bombers do the same thing. They turn northwest, climb to cruise altitude, and disappear into the dusk over the Timor Sea. Their target is 1,297 miles away. The flight will take 17 hours, nonstop. It will be longer than the famous Ploesti raid in Europe by 200 miles. No heavy bomber on Earth, except the one they are flying, can make this trip. This is the story of the supposedly clumsy American heavy bomber that was built to bomb from 30,000 feet and instead won the Pacific Shipping War at wave height and at extreme range. The aircraft everyone called slab-sided, exhausting, and harder to fly than the famous Flying Fortress. The aircraft that would outrange, outcarry, and outproduce its glamorous rival, and quietly do the work that strangled the Japanese Empire. This is the story of the B-24 Liberator. By the summer of 1942, the United States Army Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific were broken. General George Kenney took command on July 29. He arrived at his headquarters in Australia and walked into a disaster. Of 32 B-17 Flying Fortresses at Mariba Airfield, only 14 could fly. The crews were sick, exhausted, and openly counting the days until they could go home. Kenney later wrote that morale was at a low ebb, and the men did not care who knew it. The tactical problem was even worse than the morale problem. Japanese troop convoys were running unopposed up and down the New Guinea coast. American heavy bombers attacked them from 20,000 feet, the way the doctrine said they should. The doctrine was wrong. Against a maneuvering ship at sea, high-altitude bombing achieved a hit rate of less than 3%. One careful study of the early Pacific bombing campaign found that in 425 bombs dropped from altitude, the Americans hit 9 ships and sank exactly 1 cargo vessel. Kenney needed something else. He needed an aircraft that could find Japanese ships at extreme range, attack them effectively, and survive to fly home. The Boeing B-17, the famous Flying Fortress that was already winning headlines in Europe, simply could not reach far enough. The Pacific is not Europe. The distances between bases were measured in thousands of miles, not hundreds. Kenney needed range above all else, and there was only one heavy bomber in the American inventory that had it. The B-24 Liberator was designed in 1939 to a specification the Army Air Corps issued in January of that year. The requirement was simple and aggressive. Build a bomber faster than the B-17 with a higher ceiling and a longer range. Consolidated Aircraft, based in San Diego, was originally asked to build B-17s under license. The company president, Reuben Fleet, refused. He told the Army his engineers could design something better. The contract for a single prototype was signed on March 30, 1939. The deadline was the end of the year. The chief engineer was Isaac Mac Ladden. The man who gave the new bomber its character was a freelance aerodynamicist named David R. Davis. Davis had walked into Consolidated 2 years earlier with a wing design he called the fluid foil. Ladden was skeptical. The wind tunnel tests at Caltech were so impressive that the technicians ran them 3 times, suspecting their instruments were broken. The Davis wing produced 20% less drag than any conventional airfoil of its day. It was long, narrow, and efficient. It would give the Liberator the longest legs of any heavy bomber in the war. The prototype was designated XB-24. It made its first flight on December 29, 1939, 2 days before the deadline. The test pilot was William Wheatley, Consolidated's chief test pilot. The flight lasted 17 minutes. The aircraft met its range requirement, but fell short on speed. With turbo superchargers added, it would later reach 310 miles per hour. The early production aircraft were difficult. Pilots who came from the B-17 hated the new bomber on first contact. The Davis wing, for all its efficiency, had 35% higher wing loading than the B-17. That meant a higher stall speed, less forgiving handling at low speeds, and a narrower margin for error. The hydraulic flight controls were heavy. The aircraft had to be flown every second. One pilot compared it to a boxcar attempting to fly, with brakes hissing like a Greyhound bus. Another said it was like sitting on the front porch and flying the house. The numbers told the story plainly. The Liberator carried 2,364 gallons of fuel as standard, against the Flying Fortress's 1,700. It hauled 8,000 pounds of bombs against the Flying Fortress's 6,000. It cruised at 215 miles per hour against the Fortress's 182. And critically, it could fly 1,700 miles with a full bomb load. The B-17 could manage barely 1,100. The B-24 could carry more, fly farther, and fly faster. What it could not do was fly as high, take as much battle damage, or float on water if it had to ditch. In the Pacific, Kenney did not care about ceiling. He cared about reach. The breakthrough came from a man named William Grover Ben. Major Ben was Kenney's personal aide. He was 33 years old, born in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, and quietly obsessed with the question Kenney had handed him. How do you hit a moving ship from an airplane? The answer Ben found was not entirely original. The British had experimented with skipping bombs across water, the way a child skips a stone across a pond. Ben took the idea, refined it, and made it operational. Kenney removed him from his personal staff and gave him command of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron of the 43rd Bomb Group, with full authority to teach the technique to combat crews. The method was simple in description and terrifying in execution. The bomber approached the target at 200 to 250 feet of altitude, traveling at 250 miles per hour. At 300 yards from the ship, the pilot released a stick of 500-pound bombs. The bombs were fitted with delay fuses of 4 to 5 seconds. They hit the water, skipped across the surface, and slammed into the side of the enemy ship at the waterline. The delay fuse let the bombs sink alongside the hull before detonating. Lieutenant James Murphy, who flew skip bombing missions under Ben, later wrote that the explosion underwater often broke the ship in half. Kenney admitted the fuses were imperfect. He said sometimes they went off in 3 seconds, sometimes in 7. But that was good enough. If you are finding this interesting, subscribing takes a second and helps the channel. Now, back to the war. The first operational use came on the night of October 22, 1942, against Japanese shipping in Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. 6 aircraft from the 63rd Squadron came in low. Captain Franklin Greene made the first successful skip bombing attack in American history, hitting a light cruiser and a 5,000-ton cargo ship. Captain Kenneth McCullough sank a destroyer with 2 hits amidships. Hit rates that had been below 5% jumped above 70%. Kenney now had a way to kill ships. Ben did not live to see how far his idea would travel. On January 18, 1943, he took off from Jackson's airfield at Port Moresby on a reconnaissance flight and flew into fog over the Owen Stanley Mountains. The aircraft hit a ridge. All 7 men on board were killed. His remains were not found until 1957 by an Australian survey team. Kenney later wrote that no one in the Pacific Theater had made a greater contribution to victory than William Ben. The same week Ben died, Time magazine published a profile of him, describing the new tactic to the American public. The article appeared on the day he went missing. McCullough followed 3 months later. On April 12, 1943, his B-17 struck a wallaby on takeoff at 7 Mile Drome, severing the hydraulic lines. The aircraft caught fire, lifted briefly into the air, then crashed and detonated its full bomb load. McCullough and his entire crew were killed. He was 24 years old. He had flown 68 combat missions. Kenney called him a master craftsman at the art of sinking Japanese vessels. The skip bombing technique spread fast, but it spread to other aircraft. The B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine medium bomber, proved more agile at wave height than any heavy bomber. By the time of the Great Convoy Battle, the heavy bombers had moved on to a different role. The B-24 Liberator was no longer the skip bomber. It had become something else entirely. It had become the long arm of the Pacific. By mid-1943, the Liberator had replaced the Flying Fortress in every Pacific heavy bomber group. The 43rd Bomb Group, Ken's men, converted from B-17s to B-24s between May and September. The 90th Bomb Group, the Jolly Rogers, had been flying Liberators since they arrived in Australia in November 1942. Their first commander, Colonel Arthur Meehan, vanished on a Rabaul mission on November 16, 1942. His successor, Colonel Arthur Rogers, gave the group its name and pioneered modifications that bolted nose turrets onto Liberators to fight off head-on attacks by Japanese fighters. The 307th Bomb Group earned the name Long Rangers on its first major mission. 27 Liberators staged from Midway and bombed Wake Island between December 24 and 27, 1942. The round trip was 2,240 miles. No B-17 could have made it. Every aircraft returned safely. By the end of the war, the 307th would sink 27,440 tons of Japanese shipping and damage over 112,000 tons more. They would shoot down 355 Japanese aircraft. The defining moment for the long-range Liberator came over the oil refineries of Balikpapan, on the east coast of Borneo. Balikpapan produced roughly half of all Japanese aviation fuel and most of the lubricants the Japanese Air Force depended on. It was beyond the reach of any bomber Allied forces possessed. Until August 1943, the 380th Bomb Group, the Flying Circus, operated B-24s from Fenton Airfield in the Northern Territory of Australia under Royal Australian Air Force operational control. On the afternoon of August 13, 12 Liberators took off at 5-minute intervals, each carrying 6 500-pound bombs and 3,500 gallons of fuel. The total weight at takeoff was 66,000 pounds. The aircraft barely cleared the trees at the end of the runway. The round-trip distance was 2,600 miles. The flight lasted 17 hours, nonstop, over open ocean and tropical fronts. It was longer than the Ploesti raid in Europe by 200 miles. 9 of the 12 aircraft reached the target through the storms. The Japanese, who had never been hit at Balikpapan before, had left the city brightly lit. The first Liberator over the refineries arrived at 12:20 in the morning. Its bombardier was Jim Wright. That night he dropped his bombs into the heart of the Japanese fuel supply. The follow-up raids on August 15 and 18 met heavy resistance, but the damage was done. The refineries were temporarily shut down. Stored fuel was destroyed. 30,000 tons of shipping were sunk in the harbor. The Japanese were forced to redeploy fighter strength from New Guinea to Borneo to defend their oil. The 380th received a Presidential Unit Citation. No other heavy bomber on Earth could have flown the mission. Now compare this honestly. The B-17 Flying Fortress was in many ways the better aircraft. It had a higher service ceiling by 7,600 feet. It carried 13 heavy machine guns to the Liberator's 10, making it statistically more lethal to attacking fighters. It absorbed battle damage that would have torn a Liberator's narrow Davis wing to pieces. It was easier to fly. One pilot who flew both types said the Fortress would just about fly itself once trimmed. while the Liberator had to be retrimmed every time the crew moved around inside it. The fortress floated on water if it had to ditch. The Liberator broke apart and sank in seconds. In Europe, where the targets were close and the flak was at high altitude, the fortress was the right aircraft. None of that mattered in the Pacific. None of it. The Pacific did not care about ceiling, because Japanese fighters could climb above any altitude an American bomber could reach. The Pacific did not care about formation stability, because most strikes were small, dispersed, and at the limit of fuel. What the Pacific cared about was range, payload, and presence. The Liberator carried more bombs, it flew farther, it cruised faster. It got there. By mid-1943, the Flying Fortress had been pulled out of Pacific heavy bombardment entirely. And the Liberator was carrying the war alone. There is a myth that needs to die. The myth is that the B-17 Flying Fortress was the primary American bomber of the Second World War. It was not. The Consolidated B-24 Liberator was built in greater numbers than any American military aircraft in history, before or since. 18,482 airframes. 45% more than the Flying Fortress. 5 factories built it. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, the largest factory under one roof in the world, eventually produced one complete bomber every 63 minutes. In April 1944, 100 bombers flew out of Willow Run in 3 days. The Army told Ford to slow down. They had nowhere to park them. The Liberator served in every theater of the war. It hunted submarines in the Atlantic and was credited with sinking or helping to sink 93 German U-boats. It carried fuel over the hump from India to China. It bombed Ploesti, Berlin, Vienna, Wake, Truk, Rabaul, Balikpapan. It was the workhorse heavy bomber of the United States in the Pacific from mid-1943 until the end of the war. After the war, almost all of them were flown directly from the factory or the squadron line to the desert scrapyards of Arizona and cut up for aluminum. Today, only 13 complete airframes survive. The Flying Fortress, by contrast, found post-war work in firefighting and search and rescue, and over 40 examples remain. That is why one is famous and one is forgotten. Not the fastest, not the most famous, not the prettiest, but the bomber that flew when nothing else could fly far enough. The bomber that put bombs on Borneo from Australia, on Wake from Midway, on Truk from the Solomons. The bomber the men called Clumsy. The bomber the press ignored. The bomber that did the work. The Liberator was built for the wrong war, and it won the right one.